Recently, while I was digging through my parents' loft trying to have a clear out, I unearthed a treasure trove. Years worth of old Edge magazines, a large CD case full of Xbox, GameCube, and PS2 games, and maybe most interestingly of all, an old Nintendo 64, which even had a few game cartridges and a pile of game controllers with it. The reason this is interesting in particular is because I don't know where it came from. I've never owned a Nintendo 64 in my life. Is this the start of one of those really bad creepypastas? What was even more amazing about this was it still worked. Within minutes of setting up the console, I was playing rounds of Perfect Dark multiplayer. Playing this game again was a fantastic experience. It transported me back to nights as a kid playing N64 at my friend's house, getting shouted at by his mother for shouting and laughing so loudly that she couldn't hear the TV. At least, I think that's what she was shouting up the stairs. It was hard to hear her over the sound of 50 remote mines exploding all at once. With every hour of playing Nintendo's 64th home console that passed, however, I found myself thinking less about the game I was playing, and more thinking about what I was holding in my hands. The Nintendo 64 controller. It's really kind of awkward and cumbersome. The two handles that you need to hold for playing it are too close together, and it feels really cramped, like my hands get sore playing this thing for too long. The controls for most games feel really clunky and unintuitive, especially the combination of like movement with the stick and camera control with buttons. It's got three handles for some reason. It's impossible to hold the controller in a way that you can actually reach all of the buttons and sticks comfortably. Did Nintendo expect humans to imminently evolve an extra hand all of a sudden? And where was this hand going to evolve from? And yet, despite all of that, I can't say that I hate it, even without comparing it to its rival contemporaries. Things like the Sega Saturn controller, or the PS1 controller, or the DualShock controller, or even the Nintendo controllers that preceded and followed it, the Super Nintendo controller and the GameCube controller. The N64 controller seems like an aberration. It's weird, it's unique, it's utterly and completely alien as to what a video game controller should be. And I kind of love it for that. Like, at first glance, the Nintendo 64 controller is an abomination. It's easy to see why it's been the butt of so many memes and jokes for almost 3 decades, but it's also my favourite three-pronged boy, and I will die defending it. This controller simultaneously fascinates and haunts me. Nintendo is probably one of the most innovative video game creators in history. The Nintendo 64 controller wasn't made thoughtlessly. A great deal of thought must have gone into the design and production of the controller for its flagship home gaming console. But as much as I wanted to sit still and enjoy blasting some bots in Perfect Dark, the more I have to hold this beautiful monstrosity of a controller, the more I need to know the answer to the question. Why did they make the controller like this?
Something's gone wrong in the happy-go-lucky world of Nintendo.
The Nintendo 64, and more specifically Super Mario 64, a launch title for the console, marked a turning point in video game design. And yes, I am very keenly aware that Mario 64 wasn't the first 3D game in history. I want to try and keep this video as focused and concise as possible, so we're going to skip over the history lessons. I'm not here to claim it was first, I'm simply here to briefly chronicle its meteoric impact. Because Super Mario 64 was most certainly a historical milestone and a pioneering game that set the standards for gaming's transition into the new dimension. It was the power of Nintendo's latest console, with its massive 93.45 MHz CPU and 4 MB of RAM that you could expand to a gigantic 8 MB if you bought an expansion pack, that made this leap forward possible, and the company created the latest Mario in tandem to take advantage of this power and show off what its new hardware could do. Creating a fully 3D game world for players to explore prompted a re-examination of even the most basic fundamentals of game design. A core question emerged that needed to be answered immediately. How do you move through a fully 3D space? For two-dimensional movement, the D-pad was perfect, as you spent all of your time either moving left or right. Even in the burgeoning FPS genre, where games such as Wolfenstein 3D or Doom gave players 3D levels to blast through, the D-pad or keyboard keys, given their prominence on PC, worked well enough thanks to the first-person perspective. This control scheme was further improved in 1994 when Bungie released Marathon, which allowed players to use the mouse freely to look around. But the D-pad had its limitations. Limitations that were set to be exposed by the upcoming prevalence of fully 3D game worlds. It only had 8 possible directions of movement. Only being able to move in straight or diagonal paths wasn't going to cut it in a 3-dimensional space without that movement feeling immersion-shatteringly clunky. What 3D games needed to feel satisfying to move through was full 360-degree movement, and so Nintendo created the analog stick. This stick used continuous electrical activity running through potentiometers, which measured the exact position of the stick relative to its starting position and moved the player character accordingly. It even allowed for varying movement speeds depending on how far a player was pushing the stick away from that center. It was the perfect solution for satisfying and precise 3D movement, especially when other console manufacturers eventually followed suit with their own controllers that included analog sticks. This precision, when combined with the D-pad-like C buttons that allowed players to control the camera, contributed hugely to Super Mario 64 becoming the standard that 3D gaming would follow. But not all games would feature fully 3D worlds for players to explore, and this is what inspired Nintendo to create the controller in the way that they did for the N64, and the idea behind the 3 handles. It turns out Nintendo did not in fact believe humans were about to evolve a third hand, but rather that an increased diversity in the types of available game experiences might require a more modular way of thinking about the controller that would come in the box with the console. The idea was a controller that could be held in 3 different ways. The right position, this one, is the way we're all familiar with, holding the middle handle with your left hand and the right handle with your right hand. Then there's the left position, where you'd hold the left handle with your left hand and the middle handle with your right hand. And then there's a third position, which I'm going to refer to as the center position because I haven't seen an official name for it, where you hold the left handle with your left hand and the right handle with your right hand, which, now that I'm saying that out loud, I mean, genius, really. It's actually quite comfortable holding it like this. This would mean that different types of games could make use of the controller in different ways. A 3D platformer like Super Mario 64 would be best suited to the right position, whereas a game that required more precise manipulation of the camera might work better in the left position, and a 2D game could be better off using the center position, which mimicked the layout of previous controllers. In theory. If you've ever played on a Nintendo 64, you probably don't remember ever holding the controller in any other way except in the right position. And the problem was this little Italian bastard. When Super Mario 64 released in 1996, it felt like a true revolution in gaming. Mario had successfully made the leap from 2D to 3D, and a big part of its success was how intuitive and effortless it was to control the diminutive Italian plumber. A lot of people who bought an N64 or had one bought for them for Christmas played Mario. Super Mario 64 set the standard not just for hundreds of 3D games to come, but also the way in which players used the N64 controller, which was great. Despite its ostensibly awkward and weird design, people got to grips with the controller quite easily. Mario 64 was a defining moment in the console's history, and even when people were finished it and looking for something else to play, no other game afforded a compelling reason for players to hold the controller any other way. And so, a standard was set. This standard ensured that everyone who developed a game for the system after that adopted the same control scheme. And the other 2 layouts that Nintendo had envisioned for its unusual controller almost immediately fell by the wayside. The unique modularity of the N64 controller was inadvertently doomed by the runaway success of Super Mario 64. You can actually see this exact issue in action in an Iwata Asks segment in which late president and one of the best of us, Satoru Iwata, talked with several members of Treasure Core Limited about the development of Sin and Punishment star successor for Nintendo Wii. In the interview, Iwata asked Treasure President Masato Maegawa about development of the first game on Nintendo 64, which was never released in the West despite gaining a cult following among Western importers. Maegawa talked openly about wanting Sin and Punishment's controls to be designed around using the left position. Sin and Punishment did include a control scheme for the left position when it launched, but it wasn't a default control scheme. Instead, it was included to allow left-handed players the ability to flip the controls, which is a pretty neat feature. I don't know if there are many benefits to having a way to flip control schemes if you're left-handed. I'm not left-handed, and there aren't many modern games that include that option as far as I'm aware. but I'd be fascinated to know if this would make games easier to play, so please, if you're left-handed, let me know in the comments. Unlike 3D platformers, one genre that had a much harder time making the jump to 3D on Nintendo 64 were first-person shooters. Analog sticks were a revolution for the genre, though that revolution would have to wait until developers started to fully realize the potential of dual analog controllers, allowing players to move with one stick and lock with the other. Halo Combat Evolved on Xbox would start that revolution, but it was actually preceded a year earlier by Alien Resurrection on PlayStation 1 using the same mechanic. But when Alien Resurrection launched, the world wasn't quite ready for this control scheme. Here's a snippet from GameSpot's review of the game in 2000. The game's control setup is its most terrifying element. The left analog stick moves you forward, back, and strafes right and left, while the right analog stick turns you and can be used to look up and down. Too often, you'll turn to face a foe and find that your weapon is aimed at the floor or ceiling, while the alien gleefully hacks away at your midsection. It's really wild to look back at a review calling what we now take for granted as the standard control setup for modern first-person shooters the most terrifying part of the game. Especially a game that has xenomorphs in it, like one of the most nightmare-inducing monsters to ever grace movie screens. Due to its single analog stick, the N64 controller simply wasn't well designed for first-person shooters. The default control schemes for games like GoldenEye and Perfect Dark were awkward for the time, and feel even weirder now that we've all gotten used to the more standardized controls that were pioneered by Alien Resurrection and Halo. It certainly wasn't the games themselves. Perfect Dark received an immaculate port to Xbox 360 in 2010, complete with modern controls, the type of controls we'd consider standard today. It's a fantastic experience, partly because the frame rate doesn't tank into the single digits when you set off too many explosions, but mostly because playing the game with a more modern control scheme on a controller with two analog sticks just feels more comfortable. For first-person shooters on the three-pronged Nintendo controller, the standard control scheme saw the analog stick controlling forward and backward movement and turning, while players would look up and down and move the camera left and right with the C buttons. There were alternative control schemes, including the one that was found in Turok Dinosaur Hunter. You move with the C buttons and look with the analog stick. It's closer to the Halo control scheme, but backwards. Turok's control scheme was offered as an alternative in Perfect Dark, which I tried out for about half an hour, and maybe it's just because I spent the last 25 years playing with Halo controls, although in this house we call them Alien Resurrection controls, but it was something I had significant difficulty adjusting to. It kind of felt like trying to play a first-person shooter while holding the controller upside down. Funnily enough, the developers at Rare must have known that using two analog sticks was going to be the future, because GoldenEye and Perfect Dark both featured alternative control schemes that utilized two N64 controllers for single player, which allowed the use of both sticks and made you look like the coolest person in the world while you were blasting your friends to death. I've always had a soft spot for the N64 controller, like I do with anything that's a bit weird and a bit different. I guess it kind of reminds me of myself. But learning about Nintendo's thought process and plans for it while making this video, I've really come to appreciate why the controller is the way it is. Sure, it's awkward and cramped, and many of the ideas that spurred its design didn't quite pan out, but learning a little bit more about the thought process behind it makes me like it a lot more, even if it is still uncomfortable for my old withered hands to hold for long periods of time. It's doubtful we'll ever see anything like the N64 controller again. On the one hand, that's a good thing. The controllers for all three major consoles are very comfortable, easy to hold and easy to use, and aside from constantly forgetting where the X button is, the standardization is pretty helpful when switching between platforms. But on the other hand, I can't help but feel like we've lost something in abandoning grand experiments like the one that birthed the N64 controller. These experiments made leaps forward in hardware feel exciting. There was a sense that something radically different and potentially game-changing might just be around the next corner. And they often were. Even the failed experiments proved worthwhile eventually in their own way. The Nintendo 64 controller might not have lived up to the potential that Nintendo saw in it, but it also gave us the analog stick, which Sony took and doubled to literally game-changing effect. The Wii U was a failure with its awkward tablet controller, but that controller was arguably an important step towards the hybrid handheld home console design of its successor, the Nintendo Switch. And on the third hand, I do wonder what might have been if Super Mario 64 hadn't launched alongside the Nintendo 64. Would we have seen a bunch of different developers utilizing the different potential control schemes in unique and interesting ways instead of defaulting to the right position than everyone was used to? Would all controllers have 3 handles now? Would Sony have added a 4th handle to their next controller out of a sense of one-upsmanship? We may never see anything like the Nintendo 64 controller again, and I think that's a little bit sad, but maybe the design philosophy behind it isn't totally gone. At the Nintendo Switch 2 reveal recently, Nintendo showed off a brand new way to play with the new Joy-Con 2. Mouse mode. You can flip both Joy-Cons to play special minigames in Super Mario Party Jamboree, or play the new wheelchair basketball game Drag X Drive, vehicle sports game, what the fuck Nintendo, why are you the way that you are? Or use the right Joy-Con as a mouse for aiming in Metroid Prime 4, or as a cursor in Civilization 7. And that's on top of all the other ways you can use the Joy-Cons, together as motion controllers, separately for 2 different players to play together, or attached to the Joy-Con grip to function as a more traditional game controller. The Joy-Cons are a single controller that can be used in multiple different configurations to play a wide variety of games in a wide variety of ways. Maybe the spirit of my favourite 3-prong boy is alive and well after all. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go and play some more Perfect Dark. Thank you very much for watching.